I'm glad that you could join me today. I realize that we're all kind of cooped up and we're all wondering what will come next. But as we join together today and throughout the next few weeks on our community quilt along, I hope that you can find some comfort and some reassurance that life is going on along just fine, and that we can all pull together, work on a project, share some ideas, be that community for each other. So today's quilt along, you might want to later then invite friends to join along. Maybe you've seen what we're doing today and you think, oh, I have 3 or 4 other quilt friends. Send a message to them, reach out today and have them view it, and maybe they can go through their scrap bin too and create a really fun project. What we're going to do is work on a quilt that can be as scrappy as you want to. The original quilt was done with charms, and you'll find the link at the on the banner in at the bottom, so that there are 9 patches, and 9 patches are very traditional. In a time like this, when everything else in the world seems just a little off kilter, what we need to do is find something that we find comfortable. And we thought about doing all kinds of different projects. But this isn't the time to go crazy sometimes. And when things are off kilter, you need to do something that is relaxing, something that's calming. And a 9 patch is just that. There's some really great fabrics that you've collected over the years. You've used them in projects, but you couldn't part with the pieces. And I know, because I'm the same way. I was raised to never throw anything away. You never know when you might need it. Well, those fabrics tell a story. So it's time to dig into that stash and start to plan out some ideas for our quilt along. If you have purchased in the past charm squares, which are 5-inch squares, if you aren't used to that terminology. So 5-inch squares that are prepackaged, those will work for this project. If you purchased, of course, those pre-cut 2.5-inch rolls, and you didn't know what you were going to do with them, maybe this is the project for that. And we probably have multiple of those put away, wondering, is it a rainy day? Well, it might be raining. So it might be time to dig into those. Those also are the right math for this project. Hopefully, somewhere in your stash, you have some background fabrics. They can be those neutrals that you used in other projects, and you might end up doing a very scrappy version of this. You may have used white on white or cream on cream or different grays, or if you're more of that modern twist, you may have some of those fabrics that look like newsprint or a map in the background. You can put those together as a scrappy kind of background for this quilt. If you don't have a stash of those, I bet you have enough of the rest of your stash. You can do the entire project scrappy. So let's create your story. This is our history. We're living it now. Let's create our story that we can then use later to tell people about the time the world kind of stopped just a little. Okay, so what we're going to be working on is figuring out some fabrics to use for our project. Now, I am not really quarantined, but I'm off work now, so I'm stuck at home, or at least in a townhouse, and I don't have all of my stash here. I do have another home, which I'm not living at, my daughter's living at, and I don't want to crisscross contamination maybe possibly with her, because she's still working too. So I had to dig into the stash that I had here. So that limited a little bit what I could do. But here are some of the ideas I came across. Now, this is a legitimate set of fabrics that I had left over from a project. They look like they all go together because they do. They were from a project, so that I don't get in trouble. I didn't go out and buy fabrics and I didn't order fabrics. This quilt that I made called Scoop a few years back had all these leftovers, and of course I couldn't part with them because I loved them. So now they come in handy. As I look through, these are small prints, they're fun, they all go together, and they're cheerful. We need something that brings us joy. And I don't know when and where exactly. I think it might have been in the Winterset Quilt Shop in Iowa. I purchased a piece of grunge. It happens to be just enough for the white in this project. And because I started doing some modern projects, I had a chunk of gray around that I could get a hold of. So those go together really great as my possibility. And those are probably the ones I'm going to use for this project. But you have as much fabric as I do. There's always another stash of fabric somewhere. I had this set, and I'm not really an orange person, so how do you end up with a bunch of orange fabrics? You make sheets for a daycare at some point, and they wanted color coding for each of the classrooms. One classroom was yellow, one classroom was going to be orange, and one was going to be blue. Well, I happen to have grabbed these. I have no idea why I brought them back up here, but they're all triangles off of cutting the corners for sheets that fit over stackable nap cots for kids. And, you can't throw fabrics away. They're all good. They're all coordinated. They're very modern-y looking prints. So I may have to make a second one of these as we go along. So I've got turquoise and orange. And of course, when you fall in love with a white on white, you buy a chunk of it, right? So a white on white that has circles or dots. So it looks very modern. I'd also bought, auditioning for a t-shirt quilt, and it didn't end up in it, a piece of white with a double gray, little tiny dots in it. I don't know if you can make that out there. And I think also that got kicked out from that t-shirt quilt, a really dark gray grunge, but it has that light patch in it, and it almost has a blue cast to it. So maybe it was meant to happen as another quilt. Cutting off of all these triangles is going to create a chore of cutting, because all this has been washed. It was used for, like I said, cots for kids. So it all had to be washed to pre-shrink to make sure the cot covers all fit. So I have to go back and press all this. So pressing and cutting, remember, pressing and cutting, it's not a sprint at this point, it's more like a marathon, but training for a marathon, a little at a time. So if I dig into this one, it's going to be a lot of standing at the ironing board, a lot of cutting. But dig in, figure out what you want to do. Now, I cut a few pieces, and I hope you all brought your coffee or your tea, because we're going to need a little bit for this one. When I looked at the pattern, I thought to myself, it's a 9 patch, and the fabrics are laid out in a design so that, now 2.5 inch squares, those can be cut from 5-inch charms, because a 5-inch split both directions like a window pane creates 4 2.5 inch squares. Now, before you cut into them, double check them. From company to company, charm squares can vary a little bit. Sometimes they're measuring from peak to peak on the zigzag cut that they put on them. Sometimes they're measuring from the valley, from the deepest part of that zigzag. So double check to make sure where that 5-inch square actually falls, so that you exact cut it in half both directions. Now, when I was thinking about trying to show you ideas yesterday, I thought to myself, Nancy Zeman was a really smart woman. And if you don't know who she is or was, Google her. She was a woman who taught people to sew for years and years on public television. So in honor of her, I created myself a little design board so that it would prop so you can see it. And she used to use one just like this so that her audience could see what she was working on. Because if I were to pick those up on a cutting mat, they would just all slide off. So, that felt board you learned had in kindergarten, it comes in handy now as an adult. In our pattern, originally, it's laid out so that the color falls in a plus mark, which today would make you think maybe the Red Cross, which, it kind of fits with the theme of what's going on in the world right now. because we all need that comfort brought to us by doctors and nurses. And then the neutral color is put in this position. Now, that's one way to lay out a 9 patch, but it doesn't mean you're locked into that design. Patterns, in the quilt shop, we usually call them strong suggestions, but if you're adventurous and you want to do something different, you can play with this. You could have all 4 pieces match. You could come in and do another fabric in the center, change the look of it. You could go in and play even more. And instead of having the 4 of the colors, you could use 5. Whoops, let me get them in here. Do it this way so that you have more color, and then put your neutrals out here. So it really depends on how much fabric you have. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use 2 colors. I'm not saying you have to use 3. I'm saying you can use as many pieces as you want. Now, if you have one of those scanning cuts or one of those cutting devices that cuts 2.5-inch squares, you're in luck. You could probably cut 9 different fabrics for 9 different squares and have each of your 9 patches be varied. So have a little fun. Dig into those pieces, though. It can be scrappy. If you are a lover of Civil War and you have reproductions, you're probably going to create a Civil War reproduction because you probably can come up with enough 2.5-inch squares with those. If you're a lover of modern or, say, Cafe or Tula Pink or any of the other wonderful designers who have created fabrics for us to just delight in, cut up those pieces. It only takes a few. 4 2.5-inch squares isn't very many, or even 5 isn't going to really use up everything you have, probably. In fact, most of us find that when we start cutting into our stash, it seems like it's grown because we fluff up the fabrics, and that nice organized little piece will become this massive, kind of like a souffle of fabrics. And then we get inspired even more. Once we start pulling out ideas and putting things together, let that inspiration run. It's our escape right now. We need the color and the beauty to remind us that life goes on and we're going to make it through this together. So start that cutting. Maybe you're going to have to even start at the ironing board and press those fabrics, because if they've been stored away someplace, unless you're very, very astute at folding all of your fabrics perfectly, you're probably going to have to hit the iron. So my suggestion, if ironing is boring to you and you hate pressing fabrics, move your ironing board closer to the TV. Find your favorite movie. It will make the time go fast and all of your fabrics will be pressed in no time. So here's what we can do. This 9 patch, what I think I might do, and I haven't for sure decided exactly my placement yet, but I think I'm going to do colors like this so that it makes kind of an X. And then if you get the pattern and look at it, I think I'm also going to even take that out into my sashing or in my cornerstones. But we'll see where it goes. The fun part is that everything that we do is our own. There's no right or wrong on color. You are uniquely and originally made. So your quilt will be the exact same thing. Okay, now, if it comes to sewing and got the pressing done, you've got it figured out. The other thing is, before you get to even sewing, I guess, is you need to take out that pattern and do a little bit of math. The pattern will tell you, and the trusty calculator comes out, or your phone, you need to find out or know how many blocks you're actually going to be making. In this pattern, you're going to make, let's see, you're going to have a total of, I can't see my number offhand. There are 42, yes, 42 9 patches. So you have to kind of think about, decide, okay, if I'm putting bright color in the spot where it's just gonna be 4 of those brights, or it's gonna be 5, you're gonna have to figure a little bit of math about how many pieces you need. Or here's a tip. as you're cutting, and you've got 4 that match, you decide you want to do it in top and bottom, north, south, east, west. Those pieces are going to go together in a block. If you have wonder clips, pull them out, wonder clip them together. That's a packet. That's a block. Set it aside. Do the same with the next color. If you want them to all match, put them, wonder clip them together, set them aside. If you don't have wonder clips, the good old pins that you use, the same thing. You can pin through 4 layers easily. Keep them together like a packet so that you can then see, okay, I've made progress. I took 3 little packets and I made a couple blocks, and now it's time for lunch. Give yourself that time to enjoy the process, work at it at a small pace. Don't, like I said, it's not a sprint to the end. We want to enjoy this process. So then if you're cutting background and it's going to be scrappy, you could just stack up those fabrics, those 2.5-inch pieces right beside you. I know I'm really hard. I have a hard time doing scrappy. I remember my daughter even coming into the quilt room at one point going, Mom, you just got to let it happen. And I'm like, I can't. I always want to match stuff too much. And she just start handing me pieces. And I'm like, really? And she's like, yes. So just let it happen. Don't get overly worked, because getting fabric right now is really going to be hard. Even trying to get things through the mail, they're talking about it getting a little slowed down. And maybe we do need to leave the mail service and even Amazon for the people who are drastically trying to get hold of medications or things that they need. So if you have that stash, I'm saying dig in. Enjoy those fabrics. You bought them for a reason. Okay, we've got those pieces ready to sew. Best practices. Before we actually get to sewing at the machine, I'm going to do kind of a step back, because a lot of us, and I'm as guilty as anyone, when I first started piecing, I was a seamstress. I knew how, what seam allowances look like. But yeah, I knew what a 5/8-inch seam allowance was. Wasn't so good at the 1/4-inch seam allowance. And once I actually double checked it, I wasn't very accurate. So my tip that I use when I'm working with new quilters to make sure your 1/4-inch seam is accurate is to take a recipe card. Most of us still have recipe cards somewhere in our homes, hopefully. Put that underneath your sewing machine. Turn the hand wheel, which is the piece on the end of the machine that moves the needle. Drop that needle right into one of the lines on the machine. Then lower your presser foot and look where that line to the right of the needle falls. That's an accurate 1/4-inch seam. So if your machine is allowing you to get a little bit on the excessive side when you're doing your 1/4-inch seam, or if you're making it maybe too small, this is the time to double check. Even us seasoned quilters need to step back sometimes, make sure that we're staying accurate. I did have a question last time. Someone asked if my 1/4-inch seam is accurate or consistent. Consistent was the word they used. If my 1/4-inch seam is consistent throughout a project, is that okay? Well, it is to an extent. If you are making a quilt that has all of the same size and design blocks, and you have no sashing and no cornerstones, if you're putting block to block and your seams are consistent, yes, they will fit together. But if those blocks, the one block you make, for example, is a 9-patch, and the next block you make is something very complex and it has many, many seams in it compared to the 9-patch, you're going to have an issue. And that has to do with math. Now, bear with me for just a second. In a 9-patch, there are 2 seams going each direction. So if you're consistently excess and their seam allowance is just a little bit, by maybe a 16th, that's 2/16, which is 1/8. So we have 1/8 inch over here that it's off a little, but it's close. But over here, we have 6 seams, and they're all off by a 16th, or even 8 seams. Think about 8/16. Remember math in 4th grade? Now we're 1/2 inch different here and 1/8 of an inch here. and we're trying to marry those together, you're going to have a problem. So that's why the little test of the 1/4 inch seam becomes kind of best practices. Let's put it that way. Because if we can stay accurate, then no matter what project we tackle, no matter how various our quilt project becomes, I'm going to do, maybe I'm going to do a sampler, and I'm going to do some basic blocks and some really complex blocks, and maybe ones that are applique, and it's just one big piece of background, and there aren't going to be any seams there. When I go to join those and marry those all together, everything will fit nicely, and I won't get frustrated, because frustration is the last thing we need. When we get into a pattern or a project and something just doesn't go well, we tend to want to just put it away, out of sight, out of mind, and don't want to work on it. That's not what we want. We would love to see you complete your project, because at the end of these 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks, or at some point in the future, I would love to see your completed quilts. Maybe we can have a virtual quilt show and show what we produced out of our community quilt along over the time when we were a bit confined to our sewing rooms. So, consistent seams, best practices. Okay, we have a question. The question is, the reminder is to check in with your quilt friends. I've been doing this. I thought of this earlier in the week, and some of my friends I haven't seen in a while, and I don't talk to very often because I work in a quilt shop. I usually see them sometime during the week or even through the weeks. And I realized yesterday and the day before that I hadn't really talked to anybody. So I reached out, and I decided every day I'm going to reach out and talk to 2 quilters. So I texted one who I've known for years through another quilt shop that I worked at. And she texted back that she was fine. Everything was good. She talked to her kids. She wasn't in need of groceries. And it was just a nice way to reach out. The other one I talked to last night happened to be a coworker, also a quilter. But we chatted last night. She said that if she had to listen to the television for any more minutes out of a day, her ears were going to bleed. So turn off the TV. Actually, you know, when you pick up this thing called a telephone, you can talk on it. You don't have to just text. Actually talk to someone, another human being, so that you can reach out and make sure that we're all not getting depressed, because this is a time when it's really easy to get frustrated and think everything's bad. And it's not. It's just in slow motion right now is all. But with our sewing machine at hand, our fabric stash, some 2.5 inch squares, we can put together our story for a later date. One other thing, I had somebody mention the other day, or talk about that they ran out of thread. You really ran out of thread? Or you ran out of cream and gray. You know, you probably have other thread in your stash, so you can pick up and use any color thread. In fact, I've done a lot of sewing over the years, and it was for testing and for video. And so I actually have red thread in my sewing machine in order to be able to show people what I've stitched. So at some point when somebody goes to repair one of my quilts 15, 20 years from now, they're going to go, wonder why she sewed with red thread. Put some purple and some lime green in there and enjoy it. It's inside the quilt. It won't be the end of the world. Let's see. We have any other questions that we can do? Last time, I had a couple people I didn't get to on their questions. So one was about pressing seams open or to the side. Now, a lot of times in patterns, we are told, basically suggested, to press seams to one side or another in some patterns. And other times you press seams open. The majority of the time, I'm pressing to one side. And a quilt friend once told me, and it'd be great if this actually happened, if my quilt were so used, so loved, and so worn that the seam popped and it came unstitched. When seams are pressed to one side, if it pops, there's still fabric underneath of it. So it wouldn't show the batting. And there'd be something to stitch into in order to repair it. If the seams are butted up against and pressed away like this, and you get a seam that pops, open, you're going to see batting, and it's going to be harder to repair. So I guess it's a long-term thought. Sometimes we're trying to reduce bulk, and that is the reason for pressing seams open. It's kind of a personal choice. In the quilt world, there's a lot of gray. Where there aren't any hard and fast rules on things. There's no quilt police. No one's going to jump down your throat. If they do, that's not the person you want to talk to. They have other issues going on. Another one was a question about the ironing board that I have behind me, and it's called a big board. I did not build it. It is actually mass produced and available for sale through the internet. It happens to be one that was in the workroom where I used to work. And when we closed our offices, that was an item that got to come and live with me. So a big board is a nice surface to have. I lay mine across two carts because that way it's very stable. There's no tipping. And I have grandkids. And so an ironing board with grandkids, I'm always worried about that. You know, the crisscross of the legs on an ironing board aren't real stable. So if they were to be in here and push on something and have something tip over, which is not a pretty sight to have happen, if you're going to use that big board, make sure you put it in a place very stable where no one can be injured. The other thing that we were talking about last time, and I did get some name ideas for the apple core quilt over my shoulder. I've gotten in 6 possible names for my quilt because the virus quilt just is not catchy. So we need to come up with something better. And I've gotten some really good possibilities. It's really going to be hard to pick. So I'm going to give you one more week. If you can think of something to name my apple core quilt over here, I will put it in the mix. You got one more week. So text it into the comments here, or you can go to my Facebook page at Colleen Tauke, or you can visit me in a text there. So let me know if you have a really catchy name for my apple core quilt. I have made progress, so that I told you this is not a sprint. It's kind of like a marathon, and I'm training. I enjoy doing curves, but they are tedious. But I love the end result. So one seam at a time. I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows joined in long succession from almost from the ceiling to the floor in here. I'm trying to make it big enough for a queen size bed. And I have 4 rows joined, 2 in pairs. So some of them are already joined, and then the rest is still in the plotting in progress portion. I have a stack of apple cores that I have to make 4 more rows yet. So yeah, a little at a time. I once heard a quilter, and I'll give her a shout out, Angela Huffman, who is a long armor, and she used to say, "How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time." So 1 bite at a time. Take your time. Enjoy the process. Join us next week, and get your fabrics out. Have some of those 9 patches up and going. Start building some of those. I will go into some pressing techniques. I even have a suggestion on how to use a seam ripper better. I've had, various seam rippers over the years, but a little teaser is, what is that red dot on the edge of your seam ripper really for? So, any other questions? Let's see. After cutting and piecing and pressing, my blocks shrank. How do you prevent that? Sometimes in our pressing, if we're using steam, your fabrics can react to that steam and shrink a bit. So maybe lay off the steam just a little bit. Do that steaming and pressing before you cut. So if you've already cut a lot of your blocks, maybe you just want to use a dry iron the rest of the way through this project. But next time, and I never thought about it either. My fabric comes from the shop, and I bring it into the sewing room and I start cutting. But one of the things you might want to do is, if you want to do any starching, if you're going to use a best press or some kind of a stiffening product on it, do that before you cut, because that way your shrink will already be kind of out of the fabric, and you won't get that little snap that makes your blocks just a little bit too small. So Any other, let's see if I've got any other questions. I don't have any else in the block. Let's see, there's one more. Let's see if I can get, no, I don't see any. Oh, let's see, I need to scroll through that. Okay, let's see, I can't seem to, it doesn't want to scroll up for questions. No, I'm really not a tech savvy person. This is my son's thing. When you need a tech available. I can't see any other questions. Oh, wait, here's one. Any motivational tips to help get organized and finish quilting projects? If you could see inside the closet, I might be guilty on this one. The biggest thing that I do, and I think it sometimes helps a lot of us, is to make a list. Now, I'm not saying you need to make a list as long as your arm. Just make a list of a few things that you would really like to check off that list. Maybe it's a couple of things that have just a few steps left on them, maybe a binding, or I need to cut the last couple pieces for something. Make that little list, but make it little. Don't make it overwhelming, because we all love to check things off the list. I've even been doing that with my ideas for supper, because I have nothing else to do. My husband's at work and my kids are all grown. So coming up with ideas for supper, when I get to check one off, like, oh, we did that, that feels good. It give you a sense of accomplishment. So make that little list. And if it's organizing your sewing room, oh, I don't know if I could even post the picture I took the other day. I did send it to a quilt friend, so she knows this is legit. And Laura, I know you're listening from California. My sewing room kind of had an explosion problem. I dug in, knowing that I was going to probably be stuck here for at least, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks longer. I knew that I had stuff everywhere. And if you're like me, you finish a project and you bundle up those fabrics and you stick them on a shelf and you think, I'll get back to them later. Or you tuck the tool in with it and you put it on the shelf and you're thinking, I'll find it later when I work on the project. And after a while, you have puddles of things everywhere in your sewing room. It's time to dig in. And yes, it's going to look like a mess. And yes, your husband's going to come home at lunchtime and he's going to see the mess, because mine did. And he kind of stood in the doorway and just shook his head. I'm like, it's going to be better. I promise. I'll get it cleaned up before you go. So even if it's just one closet or one drawer, put that on your list too, to go through that drawer and sort. What are tools? Tools go back on the organizer for tools. These are marking things. They should be here. The scissors go here. Go back and sort those things out. Get organized, because you know what? Once it's clean, it's so much fun. We're no different than that 4-year-old that we told, clean your room, because then they go in there and they want to play, because everything's clean and there's all this room to work. So if it's your cutting table today, just get through the cutting table and clean it off. Organize those things. When you find the stuff that you thought you lost, you're going to be so thrilled that you're going to want to work on something. And I know, because I'm a quilter too. So let's see if we have anything else. I got a couple other names for my quilt. I'm not going to reveal those yet, because I'm going to put those on the list. Those are secret. Those I'm going to keep for myself. And then we'll go through it. And I will tell you all about the different names I get in, but I'd like to reveal those at the end. So I don't see anything else on the questions. So the community quilt along, 9 patches. If you have those pre-cut 5-inch squares, if you have a roll of 2.5-inch strips that you just didn't know what you were going to use them for, or if you want to just dig into those scraps, make yourself a history with a story quilt, cut up a bunch of 2.5-inch squares, maybe find a background fabric if you have it. If you don't, keep going. Just make those scraps. And at this point, if we could just work on the 9 patches, we'll figure out the setting later, because I might have a few fun ideas. And we might learn a little bit along the way about setting and possibilities of lights and darks. So just work on those center. Find maybe that theme you want to work on. Find that stash of fabrics you put away for scraps because you just couldn't part with them. So then you can join me next week here on Community Quilt Along with National Quilt Circle. Have a little fun. Have some peace in your day. Reach out to 2 quilters you know this week and have a conversation. It's all about our story. Thanks for joining me.